Hello, and welcome to our lecture on the methods of researching and gathering data in the study of psychology. My name is Chris Gall, and I wrote today's lecture. As we go, you should feel free to stop the video and take notes or to rewind and re-listen to certain parts if you need to. And if you're in my class, then just know that each of the terms we cover in today's lecture should end up as either a flashcard or on your vocabulary list. So today's lecture is based on the College Board's AP Psychology course and exam description, and we'll be covering the first part of topic 1.2, research methods in psychology. Specifically, our target for today is that you can identify different methods of research in psychology and that you have some idea of their strengths and weaknesses. It's worth noting that this is really just an introduction to a topic that we're going to be revisiting all year as we look at various psychological studies. So as long as you get the basics and understand the key ideas, then I suspect a lot of the rest will begin to fall into place as we go through the remainder of the course. All right, so when we talk about how to gather psychological data, there's two broad categories for how psychologists organize their observations: experiments and correlational studies. And we'll talk about each one in turn. So the experimental method is what you think of when you think of science broadly. A scientist manipulates variables to see what effect that manipulation has on the outcome. The whole point is to establish if there's some kind of a cause and effect relationship between two variables and what that relationship might be. The focus on two variables is on the two variables, and it's very narrowly defined. When scientists design experiments, they attempt to minimize the impact of any other variable than the one they are manipulating. If they can't do that, then they can't be definitive in their answers. Experiments are also designed with replication in mind. If you can't replicate what you're doing, then it's not an experiment, full stop. And this has been a problem historically with psychological research, in that it can be extremely difficult to replicate a large number of very influential studies. This has largely happened because psychological conditions can be hard to replicate. After all, people are not like plants or chemicals. Each person is a new and different person each minute of each day, depending on their accumulation of experiences. Because of that, any two people, even if superficially alike, will be radically different, as anyone who's ever known a set of identical twins can tell you. It can also be difficult to replicate experiments because of what are called confounding variables. These are variables that can influence the outcome, but are not being manipulated by the experimenter. For example, did someone smile just because I told a funny joke? Or was it because they looked outside the window and noticed it was a sunny day? The sunny day would be a confounding variable to my experiment about whether or not my joke was funny. I did not manipulate it. With the joke, I can tweak the punchline to get a different result, but it still influenced my outcome. Or maybe the person just suddenly remembered the joke their younger sister told last night. Or they just saw a cute puppy. So psychologists try to overcome this in a variety of ways. They conduct experiments in labs, for example, where outside conditions can be tightly controlled. If there are no windows, it doesn't matter if it's sunny or rainy, for example. They randomly assign people to conditions. And this is really just a fancy way of saying that everyone has an equal likelihood of being in the experimental group with a manipulated condition, or the control group, where nothing is manipulated and they are measured just to provide a baseline to compare the experimental group to. This is often done by something like the flip of a coin or drawing names out of a hat. Random assignment can help minimize the differences between the groups. When they can, psychologists also try to use procedures like a double-blind study. Double-blind studies mean that neither the person gathering the data nor the person being experimented on knows if they are in the control group or the experimental group. This is done in order to minimize the impact of the researcher on the outcome. For example, if you're conducting a drug trial, if the researcher knew that someone was in the control group, they might treat them differently than if they were in the experimental group and thus color the outcome. This helps to overcome the placebo effect. The placebo effect happens when you expect a treatment to work. You'd be surprised how much your body can overcome just because your mind thinks that it can. Correlational studies are different than experiments because they are less rigorous. The whole point is not to determine cause and effect, but simply to establish if a relationship exists. Everybody say it with me. Correlation is not causation. This is a really common mistake. A correlational study will be done and people will confuse it with an experiment and think that a cause-effect relationship has been established when it hasn't. Correlational studies will tell you if the relationship exists, what type of relationship, and how strong the relationship is. Oftentimes, researchers will start with a correlational study to help them determine if they should go ahead with an experiment. Correlational studies can tell you if a relationship is weak or strong, if it is direct, so as one variable goes up, so does the other, or inverse, as one goes up, the other goes down. When evaluating a correlational study, you need your math algebra skills to help you figure out the results. But unlike those friendly lines that you graph in algebra, correlational studies look at scatter plots and attempt to determine the general shape of a relationship. We'll take some time in class to look at some examples of scatter plots to help you see this in more detail. The big thing to remember about longitudinal studies is that they go for a long time. Specifically, that they follow the same group of people across time as a way of measuring whatever it is the scientists in question are measuring. That means that they typically take several years to complete, and as a result, they require a lot of money. The nice part about all this is that it minimizes the likelihood that there are outside variables that affect the outcome of the study. Because the group in the study stays consistent, you don't have to worry about whether or not there are cohort differences between groups. Cohort differences are things like the difference between your upbringing in the age of the internet in the 2000s and my upbringing when the internet was predominantly a nerd thing and only the geekiest, most nerdy kids played around on it in the 1980s. I grew up in a time when my parents kicked me outside for literal hours each day as a kid, even if I was doing good kid things like reading. Most of you guys probably did not really grow up playing games that were organized predominantly by kids. I'm guessing, but that's been my experience, where you had to settle things out on your own when disputes arose, when you had to mutually agree on rules. Those types of things are cohort differences. And depending on what you're studying, it can make a real difference in the outcomes that you see. Cross-sectional studies are faster to complete because they study different groups of people for each age range. Thus, they take a lot less money and time to complete. You have fewer problems with people dropping out of the study before it's completed, which can cause some problems sometimes in longitudinal studies. But you have to be careful as you account for cohort effects in the structure of the study. On the previous slide, I was talking about internet usage, for example. It's worth noting that my mother, who is 70, hasn't used a computer since she retired. She has an old iPad that she sometimes uses for video calling my brother, my sister, and myself, but that's the extent of her computer use these days. I use a computer predominantly for work, but also sometimes for streaming. I'm 42 if you're keeping score, or for streaming TV shows or music. I don't typically surf the web for the sake of surfing, and my social media use is predominantly to track friends and family members who are far away. My son, who is 9, doesn't have social media, we won't let him, but loves to just play around online searching for information about his favorite football players or actors. Given the choice, he is happy to entertain himself with video games and streaming services when he's at home. He's always asking me to use my phone to search up random bits of information. Why might that be? Cohort effects. My mom didn't use a computer, even at work. She was a receptionist until she was well into her 30s. I'd have even been her early 40s. I got my first computer at home when I was around 12, and your cell phone has more processing power than my desktop did. My son has been around computers his whole life. We didn't allow him to play on them when he was really young, but from the time he started school, he's done a lot more with them. We don't pay for cable, so he basically never watches live TV, and those are the types of things that you need to account for when you're talking about cohort differences. What is the impact of growing up in different times and different contexts? Next, we'll turn to methodologies of gathering data. The first one I want to take a look at is survey research because that is the one you're most familiar with. Almost everybody at some point has filled in a survey. Whether it's an online one asking you about your experience as a customer on a given website or about your experience at a doctor's office, they're fairly ubiquitous, especially here in the United States. Surveys can be quick and easy to implement, but they are difficult to design well. That's largely because the way you phrase a question can make a serious difference in how people answer it. If I ask a question about illegal aliens, that will yield significantly different results than if I ask about undocumented workers, or if I ask about the social safety net versus asking about welfare. In both cases, we're asking about the same thing with each phrasing, but one phrasing indicates a certain level of hostility regarding the topic of the question. That's why survey designers are typically very careful about the questions they ask and the ways in which they ask them. It's also why when looking at surveys on the same topic, you can get sometimes widely divergent responses. Surveys also require that people self-report, and much like when we were talking about introspection, self-reporting is notoriously unreliable. Ask my son and I both if a pan is hot, and I will most likely say no to his yes. Same pan, asked within seconds, and yet you will get different answers because we have different pain thresholds. Ask me about my experience in a place or my thoughts on something, and they are never objective. If I'm having a bad day, I'm more likely to report a negative experience of something, than if I am having a good day, even if it's the same otherwise value neutral thing, like ordering the same meal in the same restaurant. And that's before you get into issues of whether or not people are ashamed of how they feel or whether or not they're worried about being judged for it. That was a huge problem with the polling leading into the 2016 election. Some people who ultimately voted for President Trump did not necessarily tell opinion pollsters they were planning to do so because they were worried about being judged for it. You can, and people do, use surveys to complete either longitudinal or cross-sectional research. Like I said, they're ubiquitous and they are comparatively easy to implement, especially if you're working with larger groups of people. So naturalistic observation is best used for small groups of subjects because you're observing subjects in their natural environment or a reasonably natural environment. These are great for correlational studies. That's because the observer does not get to manipulate the environment or interact with the subject once they are in the environment. In a perfect world, the scientist is merely a fly on the wall observing what goes on but not interacting with it. If you've ever just sat down and people watched, that's naturalistic observation. And the whole goal is to observe the ways that subjects interact with a given environment once they've entered it. But it is really hard to control for outside variables. So if, for example, you want to observe the ways in which groups of people interact to solve a common puzzle, maybe say an escape room, you cannot account for one of the subjects having a bad experience with a teammate earlier in the day and thus being temporarily less trusting of teammates and less willing to work with others. It's also worth noting that if a scientist or camera is seen by those being observed, it can, at least temporarily, change the ways in which they interact with their environment. An example of this would be how different kids act if they know an adult is watching them, particularly one with authority like a parent or a teacher, versus how they interact when the adult is not around. If the adult does nothing but simply sits and watches, eventually the kids forget that they are there. Same thing for cameras, and go back to behaving the way they do when unsupervised. Naturalistic observation is difficult to do across longer periods of time unless it's going to be done in multiple sittings. Thus, I might do several observations of how, say, a basketball team interacts while on the court together without worrying about the team when they are not on the court together. Since my focus is while they are on the court, it doesn't matter if I observe them off the court. In the best of cases, naturalistic observation takes me outside the sterile conditions of the lab and into the natural environment for my subjects. The last method of data gathering that we will talk about is also one of the hardest to do and use, and that is to say the case study method. Case studies are hard to do because you have to find just the right case, and they generally involve phenomena you would not deliberately do to somebody. Like the case studies done around Phineas Gage, the railroad worker in the 1800s, who accidentally blasted an iron rod through the frontal lobe of his brain. You were obviously not going to willingly remove somebody's frontal lobe just to observe how they react to losing that part of their brain. There are a great many case studies where it is something similarly accidental that happens that is traumatic to the person involved, but allows us to illustrate some key idea that is generalizable to all of us. It is that ability to generalize that is the hardest part. If you can't generalize it, then the case study itself is useless because it doesn't illustrate wider principles. Case studies are always, of necessity, longitudinal studies because we are looking at the impact of some phenomenon across time. They allow for a great deal of detail to be gathered, and can involve either correlational or experimental studies, but they are limited in what they tell you in and of themselves. They often, however, serve as a starting point for hypothesizing about some other phenomenon. The case study of a gentleman called H.M. in the literature can be illustrative of this. H.M. suffered severe epilepsy in the aftermath of an accident when he was in his late teens. The epilepsy got worse across time and was ultimately debilitating by the time he was in his late 20s. H.M. was given a lobotomy, a common procedure at the time, to attempt to solve his epilepsy, which had been resistant to other treatments. As a result of the lobotomy, H.M. lost the ability to form new memories of events in his life from the time of his surgery forward. Scientists did a number of experiments on H.M., which led to some interesting conclusions. For instance, when H.M. was given a procedure to follow, such as using a stencil to trace a given pathway, that would take time when done initially, he actually got faster with each time he did it. This is counterintuitive when you know that for him, each time he was asked to do it was like the first time as far as he knew. But it makes more sense if you realize that procedural memory is stored in a different place than declarative memory, which is those memories that you can actually articulate and talk about. And thus, while his declarative memory did not remember doing it, his procedural memory clearly did, resulting in faster speeds each time. This then allowed the scientists to make some general observations about the differences between how the two types of memory were stored and led to some additional experiments that confirmed the initial observations based on HM. So hopefully by this point you understand a little bit better about the ways in which psychological studies are designed and the strengths and weaknesses of each approach. We can really break the topics we've talked about into three different categories: the purpose of the study, cause and effect for an experiment, and whether or not a relationship exists for correlational studies, how long we are going to take to gather the data. Longitudinal studies take a lot longer than cross-sectional ones. And then what type of data and how we are hoping to gather it: surveys, naturalistic observations, and case studies. You should be able to define each of those terms and have begun to think about which situations might require which approaches. As we go through the course and are talking about different studies that we've done, be looking at the type of study it is and how it was designed to give you clues about whether or not the results are valid and being used in a proper way. Till the next